April 1956. Soviet soldiers in East Berlin break into what looks like a drainage fault and find, running nearly 500 meters beneath the border, a fully operational American and British listening tunnel. State media calls it a stunning intelligence failure for the West. What almost no one in Washington or London knows yet is that Moscow had known about the tunnel for over a year before it was ever finished. Most versions of this story treat it as a triumph of engineering and nerve, which, on its own terms, it genuinely was. But the more interesting question isn't how well the tunnel was built. It's how confidently Western intelligence trusted the flood of secrets coming out of it, without ever being able to answer the one question that mattered most. How much of what they were hearing had already been quietly shaped by the other side? By the early 1950s, Berlin sat deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, split between the Western Allies and the Soviets. It was also nearly useless for one specific kind of espionage. Listening in on Soviet military and KGB landline communications, which ran through underground cables the West had no legal or physical access to. The solution, jointly developed by the CIA and Britain's MI6, was almost absurd in its ambition. Dig a tunnel nearly a third of a mile long, starting from a secret facility in the American sector, running underneath the border completely undetected, and tap directly into the Soviet cables from below. The Americans called it Operation Gold. The British called it Operation Stopwatch. Planning meetings for the operation included a rotating group of officers from both services. Among the British side sat a young, well-regarded MI6 officer named George Blake, trusted enough to be read into one of the most sensitive joint operations of the decade. What his colleagues didn't know was that Blake had secretly been working for Soviet intelligence for several years. Blake had been captured by North Korean forces in 1950 while serving as a junior British diplomat in Seoul. During nearly 3 years in captivity, he became convinced of the communist cause and quietly offered his services to the KGB. When he was released and returned to Britain, MI6, with no reason to suspect him, welcomed him back and gave him greater access than before. Blake reported the entire tunnel plan to his Soviet handlers before construction had even begun. Moscow Center now knew the location, the purpose, and the timeline of an operation that London and Washington believed was among their best-kept secrets. This put Soviet intelligence in an unusually difficult position. Shutting the tunnel down immediately, or exposing it before a single cable was tapped, risked pointing directly at Blake as the source. He was one of a very small number of people who'd known the plan that early. So Moscow made a colder calculation. Let the tunnel be built. Let it start operating, and manage the damage from the inside instead. Through 1954 and into 1955, American engineers dug the tunnel from a warehouse-like facility disguised as a radar station, working in secrecy even from most of their own colleagues, boring nearly 1,500 feet under the sector border toward the Soviet cable lines. In May 1955, the tap went live. For the next 11 months, American and British analysts recorded and translated an extraordinary volume of Soviet military and intelligence traffic, reportedly hundreds of thousands of hours of material. More raw signals intelligence than either service had ever handled from a single source. Here's the problem historians still argue about. The Soviets knew the tap existed the entire time. That doesn't necessarily mean every word running through those cables was fabricated for Western ears. Managing that kind of disinformation at that scale for 11 straight months without a single slip would have been its own enormous undertaking. But it does mean Western analysts were evaluating everything they heard without knowing the one fact that would have changed how they read it. By April 1956, Moscow judged that continuing to protect the operation's secrecy had run its course. Soviet technicians staged the tunnel's discovery as an accident, supposedly stumbled upon during cable maintenance after heavy rain, carefully avoiding any detail that might suggest they'd known in advance. The performance worked. Nobody in the West suspected a mole for years. For years afterward, both the CIA and MI6 quietly regarded the Berlin Tunnel as one of the great intelligence achievements of the early Cold War. An audacious, technically brilliant operation that had, by their own internal assessments, delivered real strategic value despite its eventual exposure. Blake's betrayal had nothing to do with the tunnel's discovery. It came out separately, in 1961, after a Polish intelligence defector named Michael Goleniewski passed information that eventually led British counterintelligence back to him. Only then did anyone realize the man who'd sat in on the original planning meetings had been reporting to Moscow the entire time. Blake confessed and was sentenced to 42 years, one of the longest prison terms in modern British history. He served only 5 of them. In 1966, with help from fellow prisoners and outside sympathizers, he scaled a wall at Wormwood Scrubs prison and eventually made his way to Moscow, where he lived out the rest of his life as a celebrated hero of Soviet intelligence. Blake's exposure forced a quiet, uncomfortable reassessment inside Western intelligence. Every piece of material the tunnel had ever produced now had to be looked at again through a different lens, not as raw, untouched Soviet traffic, but as intelligence that Moscow had known was being collected from the very first week it existed. The Cambridge Five showed what happens when trust is extended automatically to the wrong people. The U-2 incident showed what happens when a government trusts its own cover story past the point it can survive contact with reality. The Berlin Tunnel adds a third, quieter lesson. An intelligence service can build something brilliant, celebrate it as a triumph for years, and still never be entirely sure whether it was the one doing the listening or the one being heard. Next time, the double agent who fed Moscow a stream of real secrets to protect one far bigger lie. And the Cuban Missile Crisis moment his information may have helped the world quietly survive.